Welcome to this mini lecture on functionalism or functionalist approaches to translation. I call it a bootcamp because it's supposed to be a 101 functionalist sort of introduction for those who may not be familiar with the functionalist school of thought coming from Germany in the 80s and 90s. As we will discuss in this lecture, I find that functionalist approaches to translation are one of the most applicable and practical proposals from the corpus of translation theory for practicing translators. So let's start. The learning objectives for this Functionalism 101 are the following. Hopefully at the end of this introduction, students will be able to first listen and explain the key concept of functional approaches to translation, mainly the scopus, a translation brief, the source text analysis, functional adequacy. Hopefully students will be able to start analyzing texts, implementing Christiane Nord's translation-oriented source text analysis model in their translation work. Describe why the functional approaches or the functional approach is useful to translators and how it guides the translation process effectively from beginning to end, even before it starts. Explain what the functional approach means and what it does not mean. What are the consequences or the implications of the functional approach to translation and which are not or which might be misleading elements or interpretations of the functional proposals. Well, these are the learning objectives. I was forgetting one. Very important indeed. Start applying these concepts to the translation or their translation work. Hopefully in the in the series of translation assignments that we have for the semester. Some background before we start. So we have the word paradigm is important to note, coming from the Greek paradeikma, which means example, which in turn derives from the Greek paradeiknumnai, to show side by side. Therefore, etymologically or in their origin, paradigms are patterns, models, archetypes, typical instances or epitomes of certain realities in the world. These paradigms or these models, these patterns, these archetypes, in philosophy mean, and I quote from the Oxford English Dictionary, a mode or view in the world which underlies the theories and methodology of science in a particular period of history. So what are the main paradigms underlying the theories of translation? Anthony Pym, in his useful book published in 2010 on translation theories, suggests a few paradigms that would be the underpinnings of the main translation theories that we find in the corpus of the literature accumulated in what we call translation studies as a discipline. The first one would be equivalence. The second would be purposes. The third would be descriptions. The fourth paradigm from Anthony Pym would be uncertainty. Number 5, localization. And number 6, cultural translation. Equivalence, well, this is not the moment or the time right now to discuss any of these in depth. Well, my objective here is to place functionalist approaches or functionalism within the framework, the wider framework of translation studies. Obviously, functional approaches to translation are not the only theoretical framework trying to inform our view and our understanding of translation phenomena out there. We have several of them. I think Pym's summary here of these 6 main paradigms is really useful for didactic purposes. First of all, equivalence. Obviously, when we look at translation, we're looking at a source text or an original piece of literature or textual artifact, and we also look side by side with this. We traditionally have been looking at translation, and we understand translation as an artifact, a textual artifact or a text that's produced on the basis of an original text by a translator. The translator reads the original, and then his or her interpretation is reflected in the new text, a new textual production, a new textual product. And we understand translation ontologically by the being, the very being of translation is understood by its connection to the original. So equivalence or equal value is that central concept of translation, rejected by some scholars, but pervasive and ever present in the translation field, in the background, because when we try to describe translation, we're trying to describe the relationship that a translated text has with a certain original text that came before it. What value, what equality is there between both texts? So equivalence is a hugely important paradigm in translation. Second, purposes, and this is where we locate this mini lecture and this functional paradigm. Translation is seen as a human action, and human actions have aims. Therefore, it follows that translations or translation as an activity should have an aim or a purpose, that it needs to be fulfilled by that text in the midst of certain target readers. Number three would be descriptions. This is what we call descriptive translation studies. Translations are described not prescriptively, not as they should be. This is a good translation, this is a bad translation. But the scholars who follow descriptive models or descriptive paradigms mainly aim at describing texts which function or work as translations in the target cultures. And they want to answer really interesting questions as to why this translation was chosen of this text and not another, why this translation looks the way it looks, why this translation was accepted in a certain way or rejected in a certain way, etc. So we look at describing translations as they are in their habitat or environment, as it were, the target environment, the receiving end. So we would look at translated literature into English, and then we would look at English translations in the English environment where they are produced. Number four, uncertainty. This has to do with Derrida's deconstructionism, the idea that meaning is not stable, therefore we cannot really find equivalence between texts because meaning is elusive. Even the meaning of the source text is not static, is not there, found within the text, but we create this text. These views are heavily, as I say, influenced by Derrida's deconstructionism and postmodern views of literature and culture. Number five, localization. Localization has become a very important keyword, or is more than a buzzword. It has become a variety of translation which is more complex because it deals with the newer and most recent multimedia source texts. So localization means changing a product just enough so that it can be properly used by individuals, target users in any locale, but also coexisting with or balancing the essence of the product. So that's what localization means. We take a product and we make it world ready, and this mainly refers in our field to multimedia products, multimedia websites, video games, software products, and applications. And finally, we have number six, cultural translation, the intersection between cultural studies and translation studies. The idea that translations are artifacts of the target cultures, and they involve cultures in contact, and therefore there's a cultural factor that needs to be studied and foregrounded in translation. So these are the six paradigms that Anthony Pym identifies in 2010. And within those paradigms, I would like to underline or bring to the forefront the functionalist approach. Going back, that would be number two. So if we continue, these functionalist approaches appeared in the 70s and 80s in Germany. And we have some key contributors like Katharine Reiss. She referred to functional translation criticism. That was her main contribution. Justa Holz-Mentey, she theorized on translation as an action, as a human action, translational actions. translations are actions, human actions, and therefore they have purposes. Hans Vermeer, a very important name, with his Scopus theory, that was his main contribution to the field, and he's the late Vermeer is the most remembered amongst the functional scholars. And then we have Christiane Nord, who became one of the most active advocates of functionalism, and building on the work of the previous three, made one of her most salient contributions was a model for translators to study and analyze source text oriented towards translation. And that was, if memory serves, that was the topic of her dissertation. And she has been active, now retired, I think, emeritus professor. She has a long, fruitful career training translators in Germany. So translation mainly is a human action. This human action involves several stakeholders. Translators are one of those agents involved there. And we have stakeholders, individuals who participate in the translation process. Translation being a human action and involving communication, we look at purposes. What purposes do the translations that we create fulfill amongst the target readers? And target texts must be looked at as adequate if they fulfill, or if they match, if they live up to the expectations built around them, or the purposes assigned to them in the target setting. So that's a very important thing to remember. If we continue, I like to mention, as Christiane Nord did in her useful book in 1997, now in second edition, functionalist approaches have been developed mainly within university translator training institutions. So they have a training thrust, a mission to improve the training of translators. They are normative, she continues, or evaluative to the extent that they include the evaluation of translations with regard to the functionality in a given situation in culture. Future professional translators must be trained not only to produce good, that is, functional translations, satisfying their customer needs, but also to find good arguments to defend their products against unjustified criticism from clients and users. Translation is a vulnerable activity. Many of these stakeholders involved in the translation process will be judging the translation products produced or put forward by translators, revisers, customers, project managers, end readers in general. So we need a framework that we can use to evaluate or assess the quality of a translation against certain norms or against certain frames of reference. This is one of the first useful benefits from functional approach to translation. It provides a common frame of reference for the stakeholders involved in the translation process. Hans Vermeer, there's a picture of the late Hans Vermeer. He was the founder of Scopus and the father of Scopus theory. He was professor of general and applied linguistics in University of Mainz and Gemeinschaft. He was chair of translation studies at Heidelberg University, and he published more than 300 works. It's taken from his obituary in 2010. In the following, the next part of the discussion, we will delve into a brief discussion of the Scopus theory put forward by Mr. Vermeer.